Gouged eyes and chawed ears. The rough-and-tumble world of Breckinridge Elkins. A paper given at the 2011 PCA-ACA National Conference by Jeffrey Shanks. Texas author Robert E. Howard is best known today for his sword and sorcery tales of Conan the Cimmerian. But like many other writers for the pulp magazines of the early 20th century, he contributed stories to a number of genres, including historical adventure, horror, boxing stories, hard-boiled detective tales, and of course, westerns. As one might expect from the creator of Conan, Howard's stories often contain larger-than-life protagonists fighting, slashing, and shooting their way through a harsh, violent, cynical world. More surprising, however, is the fact that Howard actually had some of his greatest commercial success writing humorous stories, particularly humorous westerns. Of these, the best known and most successful are the tales of Breckinridge Elkins, a giant of a man from Bear Creek in the Humboldt Mountains of Nevada. Written in the style of the tall tale tradition, 18 Breckinridge Elkins adventures appeared in the pages of Action Stories magazine from 1934 to 1937. These stories, along with several unpublished tales, have been reprinted in book form a number of times over the last 70 years, most recently in a collection from the University of Nebraska Press. Breckinridge Elkins is a good-natured young man of great size and strength, but he's not the brightest individual, and he's incredibly naive about the world outside the mountains where he grew up. Narrated in the first person, we see the world of the Old West through Breckinridge's own eyes and described in his local dialect. The humor in this series usually comes from his misunderstanding the situations in which he finds himself, and in the riotous mayhem that often ensues, as he wanders around the frontier towns of the Southwest. Like Conan, Breckinridge Elkins is the barbarian monkey wrench that falls into the cogs of civilization, but with much more comedic results. Most of the comedy in these tales takes the form of ultra-violent slapstick that is so over the top that it becomes a form of dark humor. Think Pecos Bill meets Kill Bill. This paper will address a particular violent motif that occurs frequently in the Breckinridge Elkins stories: rough-and-tumble fighting. A reference to rough-and-tumble fighting appears in the opening paragraphs of the very first Breckinridge Elkins story, Mounted Man, as Breckinridge's father gives his boy some interesting advice before sending him off to the frontier town of Tomahawk. "Don't be tetchy, but don't forget that your pap was once the rough-and-tumble champion of Gonzales County, Texas, and whilst you're feeling for the other feller's eye, don't be careless and let him chaw your ear off." Rough-and-tumble fighting is a uniquely American style of unarmed combat that was prevalent in the South and on the western frontier in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's characterized by the use of brutal biting and gouging tactics that would horrify most modern boxing or mixed martial arts fans. Rough and tumble was not simply uncontrolled violence. It was a fighting system with standard techniques that generally involved grappling and pinning the opponent in order to bite off the nose or ears or use a thumb to pop out the eye. Some fighters who frequently engaged in these contests would even file their teeth to points and harden their nails by holding them over flames. Historian Elliot Gorn has described rough-and-tumble fighting as an expression of the, quote, intensely competitive status system, end quote, that existed in the violent and poverty-stricken atmosphere of the southern backcountry and western frontier. For the lower class, this brutal form of fighting functioned in the same way that traditional dueling did for the upper class, as a violent means for redeeming one's honor. Much of our information on rough-and-tumble fighting comes from stories of individuals traveling through some of the less settled areas of the American South. For example, Englishman Charles William Jansen described a rough-and-tumble encounter that he witnessed while traveling in Georgia in the early 19th century. "We found the combatants fast clenched by the hair, and their thumbs endeavoring to force a passage into each other's eyes, while several of the bystanders were betting upon the first eye to be turned out of its socket. For some time the combatants avoided the thumb-stroke with dexterity. At length they fell to the ground, and in an instant the uppermost sprung up with his antagonist's eye in his hand. The savage crowd applauded, while, sick with horror, we galloped away from the infernal scene." Robert E. Howard seems to have been familiar with rough-and-tumble fighting, and even practiced some of the techniques himself. In a 1923 letter to one of his friends, a 17-year-old Howard writes, "We had an enjoyable time engaging in rough-and-tumble wrestling. No holds barred. Kick, knee, hit, or gouge. Good exercise and teaches you to use everything you have. Fists, feet, fingers, everything. One of the guys was standing on a tractor. I grabbed him and jerked him off, and he jabbed his thumb in my eyes as we fell. I had one of the guys down once, one hand at his eyes and the other at his ribs, and he kicked me in the groin. Darn near laid me out. We had a fine time." This early letter gives us a taste of Howard's sense of humor that would appear in his stories years later. Exaggerated violence described in deadpan fashion, as though being kicked in the groin or thumbed in the eye is a perfectly ordinary occurrence. In returning to Mountain Man, we see that the contrast between backcountry rough-and-tumble fighting and sport boxing provides one of the more humorous scenes in the story, as Breckinridge finds himself as a participant in a bare-knuckle boxing match. Unfamiliar with sport boxing, he is confused when his opponent, O'Toole, starts hitting him. After some explanation from his exasperated cornerman, Breckinridge finally seems to understand. "Oh," I said, suddenly seeing light. "This here's a fight, ain't it?" If a fight was all they wanted, I was satisfied. All that talk about rules and the yelling of the crowd had me so confused I hadn't knowed what it was all about. I spit out a mouthful of blood and got my hands on him and started chewing his ear, and he squalled like a catamount. For Breckinridge, fight means rough and tumble, not boxing. O'Toole is clearly not unfamiliar with this type of fighting and adjusts his approach accordingly. He gasped, "If you want to make an alley fight out of it, all right. I wasn't raised in 5 Points for nothing." He then rammed his knee into my groin and groped for my eye, but I got his thumb in my teeth and began masticating it, and the way he howled was a caution. The fight ends in dramatic fashion when Breckinridge sends O'Toole flying from the ring with a mule kick. The blatant fouling sends the crowd into a rage and a riot ensues. The gag here is not simply the slapstick violence, but rather the disconnect between Breckinridge's backwoods understanding of what a fight is supposed to be and the more civilized rules of traditional pugilism. Pap's reference to rough-and-tumble fighting earlier in the story was not just a throwaway line, but was placed there quite intentionally in order to set up this scene with the boxing match. Cataloging an exhaustive list of rough-and-tumble references in Howard's humorous westerns is beyond the scope of this paper, but a few examples from the text should demonstrate how the fighting style tends to be used as a comedic device. "His only reply was a promise to eat my heart with no seasoning, and then he sunk his teeth into my ear and started to chaw it off, whilst gouging for my eyes with both thumbs and spurring me severely in the hind legs. And if Joel Gordon hadn't been so stubborn trying to gouge me, he wouldn't have got his leg broke neither. I'm going to chaw Bill Glanton's ears off for saddling that critter on me." "Let me at him," howled Joel, gnashing his teeth whilst blood streamed down his whiskers. "He's broke 3 of my fangs, and I'll have his life." "Stand aside, Breckinridge," raved Erath. "No man can chaw an ear off of me and live to tell the tale." Hawkins lost his knife in the melee, but he was as big as me and a bear-cat at rough and tumble. We would stand up and wail away with both fists, and then clench and roll around the floor, biting and gouging and slugging, and once we rolled clean over Uncle Esau and kind of flattened him out like a pancake. The matter-of-fact way in which Howard describes the characters attempting to blind and maim each other as though it's no big deal is a typical way in which violence is portrayed in these stories. This is not a stylistic device that is unique to Howard, but as we will see, it is part of a long and rich literary tradition. In fact, rough-and-tumble fighting was a common element in frontier folklore and traditional Southwest humor, genres which clearly inspired the Breckinridge Elkins tales. The frequency of this type of fighting as a literary convention in frontier humor even led to the development of a sort of stock character known as the ring-tailed roarer. The roarer was not only a pugnacious scrapper, but also a prodigious braggart, often bellowing out a formulaic series of boasts prior to engaging in a scrap. Legendary keelboatman Mike Fink and frontiersman Davy Crockett were both said to be expert rough-and-tumble fighters, and the fictitious tales of their exploits often cast them in the mold of the ring-tailed roarer. As with Howard's humorous stories, the gory details of rough-and-tumble fights, when told in a folkloric context, are often exaggerated to the point that the description becomes a form of dark humor or violent camp. For example, "I then caught his ear in my mouth, gin his head a flirt, and out come his ear by the roots. I then flopped his head over and caught his other ear in my mouth, and jerked that out the same way, and it made a hole in his head that I could have rammed my fist through, and I was just going to, when he hollered 'nuff.'" Descriptions like this no doubt horrified many of the more civilized readers back east. But the wild folk living on the fringes of American hegemony, where violence was a way of life, seemed to revel in this kind of sadistic humor, and even in the depictions of themselves as fierce savages. Folklorist Richard Dorson suggests a partial reasoning behind this. Maybe the frontier laughed so uncouthly because it was branded uncouth. Somewhat in the manner of an oat-sowing youth, it boasted of its shortcomings. Delicacy was the password in the genteel literature of the period. In the vigorous newspaper humor of the day, it was a word unknown. Barbarous fights were described with a relish for gruesome detail. Squeamishness was a subject for disdain. A well-known example of this is the short story The Fight by Southern humorist Augustus Baldwin Longstreet, first published in 1835. In this tale, two friends who are both expert rough-and-tumblers are tricked into fighting each other. Once the fight begins, the reader is treated to several pages of brutal mayhem as the two friends tear into each other. Eyes are gouged out, noses and ears are bitten off, fingers are lost, and bones are broken. The two fighters absorb an absurdly unrealistic amount of punishment before one of them finally gives up. In reading this story, one cannot help but be reminded of one of the knockdown, drag-out fights between Breckinridge Elkins and the one man who could almost be considered his equal, his cousin, Bearfield Buckner. "He swung his leg and kicked me in the mouth as hard as he could, and immediately burst into a guffaw of brutal mirth. Whilst he was thus employed, I spit his boot out and butted him in the belly with a violence which changed his haw-haw to an agonized grunt, and then we laid hands on each other and rolled back and forth across the floor, biting and gouging. I splintered the roulette wheel with his carcass, and he hit me on the jaw so hard he knocked me clean through the bar, and all the bottles fell off the shelves and showered around me, and the ceiling lamp come loose and spilled about a gallon of red-hot ile down his back. Whilst he was employed with the ile, I clumb up from among the debris of the bar and started my right fist in a swing from the floor, and after it travelled maybe 9 feet, it took Cousin Bearfield under the jaw, and he hit the opposite wall so hard he knocked out a section and went clean through it, and that was when the roof fell in." The one periodical that probably influenced Southern frontier humor more than any other was the Davy Crockett Almanacs, published annually in the mid-19th century. These almanacs contained a number of humorous anecdotes and tall tales about life along the Mississippi River and on the western frontier, supposedly penned by Crockett himself. The true author or authors of the almanacs are unknown, but like the Breckinridge Elkins stories, they are written in frontier dialect in a first-person narrative. The almanacs describe numerous rough-and-tumble fights involving Crockett, Mike Fink, and other legendary ring-tailed roarers, always with the same humorous, over-the-top violence that we find nearly a century later in the Breckinridge Elkins tales. Whether or not Howard ever came across copies or reprints of some of the Davy Crockett almanacs, it seems clear that they are, at least indirectly, the literary ancestor of his humorous westerns. For example, the description of Crockett, newly elected to Congress, involved in a rough and tumble on the streets of Washington, D.C., sounds like it easily could have been a scene in a Breckinridge Elkins story. "He seized the waistband of my breeches as I come down, and I stuck my thumb in his eye. He roared out like a bull and tried to punch me in the bowels with one fist. By this time the people had gathered round us like it were general election, and every one said it were the first time they seed a member of Congress who had any spunk. Pretty soon I got the squatter down, and just then he fixed his teeth onto my throat, and I felt my windpipe begin to loosen. I kept my thumb in his eye, and were just going to give it a twist and bring the peeper out, like taking up a gooseberry in a spoon, when a member of Congress cotched hold of my coat tail. Then the varmint seized me by the pantaloons and tore 'em clean off. Another common motif in the Almanacs, as well as other Southern humor publications, is the fight between men and women and the wild animals of the frontier. Sometimes this takes the form of a more or less straightforward hunting narrative, and other times it can be a tall tale-like story of a frontier tough guy taking on a fearsome beast in hand-to-hand combat. Thus we hear tales of frontier folk popping out the eyeballs of bears and alligators. Davy Crockett once bragged on the floor of Congress, in true ringtail roarer fashion, that he could lick a lion in a rough and tumble. Not to be outdone, Breckinridge Elkins also takes on his share of fierce critters, including a memorable encounter in a cave with a grizzly bear that he mistakes for a wild man. It seemed to get darker the further I went, and purty soon I bumped into something big and hairy, and it went whoomp and grabbed me. Thinks I, it's the wild man, and he's on the warpath. We waded into each other and tumbled around on the rocky floor in the dark, biting and mauling and tearing. I'm the biggest and fightingest man on Bear Creek, which is famed far and wide for its ring-tailed scrappers. But this wild man sure gave me my hands full. He was the biggest, hairiest critter I ever laid hands on, and he had more teeth and talons than I thought a human could possibly have. He chawed me with vigor and enthusiasm, and he waltzed up and down my frame free and hearty, and swept the floor with me till I was groggy. For a while I thought I was going to give up the ghost, and I thought with despair of how humiliated my relatives on Bear Creek would be to hear their champion battler had been clawed to death by a wild man in a cave. That made me plumb ashamed for weakening, and the socks I gave him ought to have laid out any man, wild or tame, to say nothing of the pile-driver kicks in his belly, and butting him with my head so he gasped. I got what felt like an ear in my mouth and commenced chawing on it, and presently, what with this and the other mayhem I committed on him, he gave a most inhuman squall and bust away and went lickety-split for the outside world. Biographer Mark Finn has documented Howard's avid interest in southwestern folk traditions, and has argued convincingly that the Breckinridge Elkins stories should be seen as part of the frontier humor tradition. Certainly, Howard's use of rough-and-tumble fighting as a comedic motif in these stories illustrates how knowledgeable he was about the roots of the genre, and it lends his Breckinridge Elkins tales an air of authenticity that is sorely lacking in the similar and near-contemporary fake-lore saga of Pecos Bill. Texas folklorist Modi Boatwright observes that the anonymous writers who supplied the almanac publishers with copy during the 3 decades before the Civil War were content to present without comment and in grotesque detail contests between backwoods gougers. Unlike the dime novelists, the writers of Western pulp fiction, and the makers of Hollywood movies, the almanac writers made no attempt to secure reader identification with the characters or vicarious participation in the event. Indeed, they were not writing about events, but about concepts. Howard, too, was writing about concepts, and in that he had more in common with those almanac writers of the previous century than with many of his pulp writer contemporaries. A common theme that runs through much of Howard's work, regardless of genre, is the idea that the natural state of mankind is barbarism, the point of equilibrium between savagery and civilization, in the old 19th century model of the unilineal evolution of societies. For Howard, that barbaric ideal could be found in the men and women of the American frontier, that liminal borderland between the civilized world back east and the savagery of the western wilderness. It could be found among the keelboatmen of Natchez under the Hill, in the pioneers blazing trails through the mountains, and among the settlers colonizing the Southwest. These were the people whose natural reaction was to laugh in the face of the ever-present violence in their lives. People who celebrated that violence in the form of bawdy tales of ring-tailed roarers and rough-and-tumble fighters. Howard's Breckinridge Elkins stories have their roots planted firmly in those frontier folk tales, and should be recognized as a part of that greater Southwest humor tradition.